It started with a leaf, quiet, harmless, almost invisible in the vastness of the Andes. For centuries it lived a peaceful life among the mountain people who used it for strength, for ritual, for tradition. In that world it caused no fear, no chaos, no destruction, but history has a way of shifting when no one is watching. Because the moment this leaf fell into the hands of Western scientists, the moment its gentle chemistry was cracked open, purified, magnified, something irreversible began. A chain reaction so subtle at first that almost nobody recognized it, but so powerful that it would soon reshape nations. Doctors welcomed it as a miracle. Companies slipped it quietly into everyday products. Governments experimented with its potential. Criminal networks realized they had found the seed of an empire. And step by step, without a single dramatic explosion or headline, the world crossed a line it could never walk back from. Because once that leaf was turned into a crystal, once the formula reached the wrong hands, once profit outweighed caution, the story took a turn no one could stop. The question isn't just how a jungle leaf took over the world. It's when the world realized it had lost control, and why that moment came far too late. Before we follow this story into the places where it twists, darkens, and accelerates, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps bring these dangerous, forgotten histories into the light. Now, stay close, because something is about to happen in this story, something that changed the world forever. Before cocaine became a powder measured in kilograms and fortunes, before governments declared wars against it, before it became a symbol of excess in glittering clubs and a catalyst for fear in battered neighborhoods, it was simply a leaf. A small, unassuming leaf growing on shrubs no higher than a person's shoulder. These shrubs, Erythroxylum coca, have lived on the eastern slopes of the Andes for millions of years, catching thin sunlight on their waxy green surfaces. The leaf's chemistry evolved long before humans existed, quietly preparing itself for the role it would one day play. 5,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, indigenous peoples living in the high-altitude world of what is now Peru and Bolivia discovered something extraordinary about these leaves. When chewed slowly with a pinch of alkaline ash or lime, the bitter vegetal taste softened into something else, gentle waves of clarity, warmth, endurance. In environments where food was scarce and cold seeped into one's bones, where steep terraces carved into mountains demanded impossible labor, coca lessened suffering. It eased hunger, dulled fatigue, and lifted spirits, just enough to continue living in landscapes both beautiful and unforgiving. To these early peoples, and to the Inca who came after, coca was more than a plant. It was a companion, a sacred presence, a link between the physical and spiritual worlds. They believed it had been given to humanity by Mama Coca, the mother of the coca plant, a benevolent force who watched over those who lived close to the sky. Coca accompanied healers in their rituals. It accompanied messengers racing over mountain passes. It accompanied mourners, celebrants, farmers, nobles, and laborers. In the dark mines of Potosi, where silver was extracted at horrific cost, workers chewed coca to endure the depths. But the Inca also understood coca as power. The leaf was woven into social hierarchy. Commoners received measured portions, enough to sustain their labor, but never enough to blur the empire's ability to govern. Nobles and priests consumed it freely in sacred ceremonies. Control the leaf, control the people. It was the world's first expression of a principle that would echo centuries later in back alleys, boardrooms, and battlefields. He who controls the drug controls the destiny of many. Then, in the early 16th century, the world shifted. Spanish conquistadors arrived with guns, armor, horses, and diseases that tore through indigenous populations with unimaginable speed. The Inca Empire, once vast and organized, fell in a matter of years. The Spanish had no interest in the spiritual meaning of coca. They initially viewed it as a pagan custom, something to be suppressed. But after seeing the backbreaking mining operations in the Andes, they recognized coca's usefulness. Workers who chewed coca could labor longer with fewer rest periods. They ate less food, felt less pain, complained less. And so, in a grim twist of history, The Spanish crown became one of the earliest mass distributors of coca, not to honor tradition, but to intensify exploitation. Payment to enslaved workers often came not in money but in leaves. Coca transformed from sacred symbol to machinery of profit. Millions of indigenous people died in mines where their ancestors' sacred leaf had once been a comfort rather than a chain. For centuries, coca remained confined to the Andes. Its leaves degraded too quickly to transport effectively over long distances. Travelers and naturalists wrote about coca with fascination, confusion, or arrogance depending on their worldview. But the world was changing. The age of exploration was giving way to the age of chemistry. And European scientists were beginning to ask a new kind of question: what hidden powers lay inside the plants of the world? In 1859, a young German chemist named Albert Niemann sought the answer. Working in Göttingen, he carefully processed coca leaves using techniques that would become fundamental to modern chemistry. Through precise dissolving, filtering, and crystallizing, he isolated a white crystalline powder. It numbed the tongue almost instantly. He called it cocaine. His dissertation, published in 1860, was quiet and meticulous. Niemann had no idea he had just extracted a compound that would transform global markets, shift political landscapes, and deepen human suffering across continents. For almost 2 decades, cocaine sat largely unnoticed in scientific journals. But then came Sigmund Freud. In the early 1880s, Freud was a young, ambitious neurologist desperate to establish himself. He read about cocaine's stimulating effects and ordered some to experiment with. His personal experience was euphoric, perhaps too much so. Cocaine made him feel alert, confident, energetic. He believed he had found a miracle drug. In his excitement, he wrote a paper titled Über Coca, praising the substance as a cure for depression, fatigue, and even morphine addiction. Freud began giving cocaine to friends, colleagues, and even his fiancée. But one of his closest friends, Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, already addicted to morphine, used cocaine heavily. Instead of curing him, cocaine accelerated his decline. He spiraled into psychosis, paranoia, and physical deterioration. Freud's miracle drug had destroyed a life. At the same time, another doctor, Karl Kohler, discovered cocaine's numbing properties could revolutionize surgery. Suddenly, cocaine was everywhere in medical practice, in eye surgeries, dental work, minor operations. It was a marvel, a breakthrough in anesthesia. But the more people used it, the clearer its dangers became. Addiction spread, psychosis appeared, lives unraveled. Still, the world's enthusiasm for wonder drugs was unshakable. By the late 19th century, cocaine was added to tonics, wines, cigarettes, throat lozenges, and even children's remedies. One beverage, created by Atlanta pharmacist John Pemberton, mixed coca leaf extract with cola nut syrup. He named it Coca-Cola. Advertisements boasted its ability to ease headaches and lift mood. It quickly became a national sensation. Not just Coca-Cola, but countless brands marketed coca wines and cocaine-infused drinks to the public, embraced by politicians, inventors, royalty, and clergy. But beneath the excitement, harm grew. Addiction cases multiplied, reports of hallucinations and heart failures spread. Then came the racist panic that would reshape American drug policy. Sensationalized newspaper stories invented myths about black men supposedly empowered by cocaine to commit violent crimes. These falsehoods ignited fear and helped justify the first major anti-drug legislation in American history. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act effectively criminalized cocaine. Coca-Cola removed the drug from its recipe. Pharmacies stopped selling it. Cocaine retreated into the shadows. Yet prohibition didn't eliminate it. It merely ensured its future would be darker. By the 1920s, cocaine flowed through speakeasies and jazz clubs, weaving itself into the cultural underground. Musicians used it to play long into the night. Sex workers used it to endure punishing hours. Gangsters used it as a commodity to fuel profits. Then, for decades, cocaine receded, overshadowed by other drugs. But in the 1970s, America was changing. The optimism of the 1960s had soured into cynicism, and cocaine, clean, white, marketed as glamorous and safe, returned. At first, it was a luxury drug, the drug of celebrities, executives, rock stars. But demand grew rapidly, and in the mountains and jungles of South America, the people who would meet that demand were organizing. The rebirth of cocaine as a mass commodity began not in the glittering cities where it was consumed, but in the shadowed mountains and humid jungles where its raw material quietly grew. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, coca cultivation in Peru and Bolivia continued, much as it had for centuries, small plots tended by indigenous families whose livelihoods depended on a plant the world had not yet learned to fear. But an awakening was coming. American appetites were shifting, and a generation disillusioned by politics and drawn to experiences of escape began experimenting with substances that promised intensity, clarity, confidence. Cocaine seemed to offer all three. At first, the cocaine trade was small, scattered. Colombian traffickers, Cuban exiles in Miami, and independent smugglers ferried modest shipments from South America into the United States. The profits were remarkable. A kilo purchased for a few $1,000s in the Andes might sell for tens of thousands in Florida. Yet even then, the men moving cocaine understood something important. The true wealth was not in single shipments, but in controlling the entire chain, from the coca paste in the jungle to the powder-lining mirrors in American penthouses. It was in Colombia that the modern cocaine empire took shape. Colombia did not have extensive coca fields like Peru and Bolivia, but it had something else: access. With two coasts, one facing the Caribbean, the other the Pacific, it was perfectly positioned for smuggling. It had remote jungles ideal for hidden laboratories. It had mountain passes that hid clandestine airstrips, and it had a long history of smuggling emeralds, contraband cigarettes, and other goods. Colombians knew how to move things quietly. In the mid-1970s, a handful of Colombian traffickers began organizing what would become the most powerful criminal syndicates in the Western Hemisphere. They realized that if they could centralize processing, secure chemical supplies, and streamline distribution, they would not simply profit from cocaine, they would control it. They purchased coca paste from farmers in Bolivia and Peru, hauled it into Colombia, and processed it in makeshift laboratories built deep in jungles where the hum of insects and the whisper of trees masked the sounds of generators and chemical reactions. As the trade grew, so did the network. Smugglers developed routes that skirted international patrols. They bribed customs officials, police, judges, even politicians. They created shell companies to launder money, bought ranches to disguise airstrips, and recruited pilots willing to risk their lives flying low over the ocean to avoid radar. By the late 1970s, the movement of cocaine into the United States was no longer a trickle. It was a flood. And standing at the center of this transformation was a man who would become both myth and monster: Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Escobar's rise began in the barrios of Medellin, where he learned early that power belonged to those who took it. He sold contraband cigarettes, stole cars, trafficked small amounts of goods, but when he entered the cocaine trade, he found the path that would define him. Escobar had an extraordinary ability to combine calculation with charisma. He understood logistics, business, violence, and image-making. He built a network that spanned farmers, chemists, bribed officials, assassins, pilots, lawyers, and accountants. In doing so, he transformed cocaine trafficking from a criminal activity into a vertically integrated empire. His philosophy was simple and terrifying: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Accept his bribe or face his bullet. The choice was rarely difficult. Judges, police officers, and politicians who resisted were assassinated. Those who cooperated became wealthy beyond imagination. Under Escobar's leadership, the Medellin cartel grew into a force that controlled the majority of cocaine entering the United States. Their shipments were measured not in pounds or kilos, but in tons. Their profits were so vast that Escobar literally wrote off millions lost to rats chewing through stored currency. But Escobar was not merely a drug lord. He fashioned himself as a savior to Medellin's poor. He built housing projects, soccer fields, and community centers. He handed out food and cash. To many in the barrios, he was a Robin Hood figure, someone who gave them dignity in ways the government never had. Children wore shirts with his face printed across the chest. Families prayed for him. Crowds cheered him. Yet the same man who gave food to the hungry orchestrated murders with cold efficiency. He was loved and feared in equal measure. By the early 1980s, Escobar had helped forge what became known as the Medellin Cartel, a loose alliance of traffickers unified by profit and protected by corruption. Their operations spread across Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, the Caribbean, and the United States. But even as Medellin captured headlines, another cartel was emerging in the shadows, one that sought not notoriety but control. The Cali cartel, based in Colombia's second-largest city, was everything Medellin was not. Where Escobar embraced flamboyance, Cali traffickers embraced discretion. Where Medellin relied on violence, Cali relied on infiltration. The leaders, brothers Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela, along with José Chepe Santa Cruz Londoño and Helmer Pacho Herrera, viewed themselves less as criminals and more as businessmen. Their cartel was structured like a corporation, with departments for accounting, security, logistics, communications, and public relations. They bribed at a scale Medellin could only dream of, weaving themselves into government institutions so thoroughly that it became difficult to distinguish where the state ended and the cartel began. Meanwhile, cocaine demand in the United States expanded rapidly. In the 1970s and 1980s, cocaine was marketed, illegally but powerfully, as a clean, sophisticated drug. It was the drug of Wall Street, Hollywood, and the music industry. Powder cocaine carried none of the stigma associated with other substances. It was glamorized, even celebrated. But things were about to change. By the mid-1980s, a new form of cocaine began appearing in American cities. Crack cocaine, cheap, easy to produce, and intensely addictive, reshaped the landscape. Smoking crack delivered a faster, more powerful high than snorting powder, but its effects faded quickly, creating a cycle of craving and consumption that ravaged entire communities. Streets that had once been stable transformed almost overnight. Crime soared, families fractured, hospitals overflowed. The media, driven by sensationalism and racial undertones, portrayed crack as a plague infecting America's poorest neighborhoods. Politicians responded with harsh sentencing laws, most infamously the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, a policy that devastated black communities for decades. As the United States militarized its drug enforcement, Colombia became a battleground. The Medellin cartel responded with staggering violence. Escobar attacked judges, journalists, politicians, anyone who threatened his operations. Car bombs exploded across cities. Kidnappings became commonplace. The assassination of Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla in 1984 marked the beginning of open war between Escobar and the Colombian state. But Escobar's most brazen act came in 1989 when he ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, killing 110 people in an attempt to assassinate a presidential candidate. It was a line even his allies believed should never have been crossed. Public opinion turned sharply against him. A coalition formed, government forces, rival traffickers, and paramilitary groups united by a single goal: bring down Pablo Escobar. The hunt lasted years. It ended in 1993 when Escobar was killed on a rooftop in Medellin. His death was broadcast around the world. People celebrated. But the cocaine trade did not end. It simply evolved, and it evolved north. With Pablo Escobar dead and the Medellin cartel shattered, the world expected the cocaine trade to fade. But empires built on powder do not disappear when a king falls. They adapt, splinter, and seek new rulers. And as Colombia reeled from years of narco-terrorism, another force stepped into the power vacuum, one that preferred boardrooms to battlefields, diplomacy to detonations. The Cali cartel, having quietly expanded in Escobar's shadow, now emerged as the reigning power of cocaine. The Cali cartel's leaders had always believed that Escobar's flamboyance was his fatal flaw. Violence brought attention, and attention brought law enforcement. Their approach was subtler. They operated like an international corporation, using bribery and political influence instead of open warfare. They bought banks, factories, radio stations, and even parts of the soccer league. Their traffickers wore suits, not gold chains. Their meetings took place in luxury apartments, not jungle camps. Their conversations were about shipments, logistics, and investments, not vendettas. By the mid-1990s, the Cali cartel controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine supply. Their distribution network stretched across continents. Money flowed through offshore accounts in Panama, Switzerland, and the Caribbean. They corrupted police, they corrupted politicians, they even infiltrated the upper levels of Colombia's government. Their dynasty seemed secure, quiet, stable, but stability in the cocaine trade never lasts. As the Cali cartel rose, the United States intensified its global war on drugs. Billions of dollars poured into intelligence sharing initiatives, military training, and equipment for Colombian security forces. New treaties allowed for faster extraditions, and as pressure mounted, cracks began to appear. In 1995, the Colombian government arrested several top leaders of the Cali cartel. Soon after, the cartel fractured into smaller, less stable groups, each competing for territory and influence. But the fall of Medellin and Cali did not slow the flow of cocaine. It simply shifted the center of gravity. A new generation of traffickers was rising, north of Colombia, on the other side of a border that stretched for nearly 2,000 miles. The trade was moving to Mexico. Mexican traffickers had long been involved in drug smuggling. During the 1970s and 1980s, they transported marijuana, heroin, and contraband across the border. Their role in the cocaine trade was originally limited to transportation, moving Colombian cocaine into the United States in exchange for a percentage of the shipment. But the Mexicans were patient observers. They saw the mistakes the Colombians had made. They saw how much money was being left on the table. They began to understand a simple truth. The real power in the drug trade belonged to whoever controlled the border. The moment that redefined the Mexican drug world came in 1985 with the murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena. Camarena had uncovered ties between traffickers and elements of the Mexican government. His abduction and brutal torture shocked the United States. The fallout shattered the Guadalajara cartel, then Mexico's most powerful criminal organization, and forced its leaders to reorganize their empire. Before his arrest, the cartel's godfather, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, divided smuggling territories among his lieutenants, unknowingly planting the seeds of future cartels. To the Arellano Félix brothers, he gave Tijuana. To Amado Carrillo Fuentes, he gave Ciudad Juárez. To Juan García Abrego, he gave the Gulf. And to Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and Ismael El Mayo Zambada, he gave Sinaloa. From these territories grew the cartels that would dominate the 1990s and 2000s, but none would reshape history like the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo, a man who had once loaded aircraft for the Guadalajara cartel, began building one of the most sophisticated smuggling networks the world had ever seen. He constructed tunnels under the border, elaborate passages with lighting, ventilation, and rail systems. He bribed police, soldiers, politicians, even entire municipal governments. He pioneered new routes through Central America. And he created a system in which violence was not the exception, but a tool of negotiation. As the Colombians lost their grip, the Mexicans tightened theirs. By the early 2000s, Mexican cartels were no longer middlemen. They were the primary distributors of cocaine entering the United States. The profits soared, and with profit came war. The turning point came in 2006, when newly inaugurated Mexican President Felipe Calderón deployed tens of thousands of soldiers to confront the cartels. The intention was to bring order, but the effect was fragmentation. Large, centralized cartels splintered into dozens of smaller factions, each vying for control of lucrative smuggling corridors. Violence escalated at unprecedented speed. Entire cities became battlegrounds. Entire highways became ambush zones. Entire communities became hostages, caught between warring organizations. The death toll climbed, Bodies appeared hanging from bridges, beheadings became messages, mutilated victims were left with narcomantas, handwritten banners, warning rivals and authorities alike. This was violence, not merely for profit, but for psychological dominance. And among the new rivals emerging from this chaos, one group stood apart: Los Zetas. Originally formed by defectors from an elite Mexican military unit, the Zetas brought military tactics to organized crime. They trained recruits with the precision of special forces. They diversified into kidnapping, extortion, human trafficking, fuel theft, and assassination. They used brutality as branding, cultivating a reputation so terrifying that rivals often surrendered territories rather than challenge them. Their rise triggered even more chaos, even more bloodshed, even more suffering for civilians, caught between the ambitions of criminal armies. By the 2010s, more than 350,000 people had been killed in the Mexican drug war. Over 100,000 had disappeared. Entire families vanished into clandestine graves. Mothers searched fields with shovels and sticks, hoping to find even a bone fragment of a missing child. The war, fueled by cocaine profits, swallowed lives on a scale rarely seen outside conventional conflict. And yet the supply routes remained steady. Smuggling continued through tunnels, trucks, trains, boats, ultralight aircraft, and border crossings overwhelmed by traffic. No matter how many arrests were made, no matter how many leaders were extradited, cocaine continued moving north. Demand ensured stability. Profit ensured innovation. And as the cartels battled one another, cocaine use in America changed once again. By the 2000s and 2010s, crack had declined sharply. Powder cocaine once again became a luxury drug, especially among the wealthy. In the glass towers of Manhattan and the neon parties of Los Angeles, cocaine regained its aura of glamour and exclusivity. Bankers used it to push through sleepless work weeks. Entertainers used it to maintain energy on set. Tech entrepreneurs used it during endless cycles of launch and burnout. Cocaine became the drug of performance, of ambition, of people who believed exhaustion was weakness, but beneath the confidence lay addiction, stealthier, quieter, and no less destructive. And something far more dangerous was beginning to seep into the supply: fentanyl. Dealers began cutting cocaine with this potent synthetic opioid, often without users' knowledge. The result was a national surge in overdose deaths, many occurring among people who never realized they were ingesting fentanyl at all. Cocaine, once hailed as a stimulant of the elite, had become a roulette wheel in which even a single use could be fatal. The story was shifting yet again, and globally, the consequences of the cocaine trade were spreading far beyond the Americas. Cocaine's transformation from a regional stimulant into a global commodity reshaped entire economies, governments, and landscapes far beyond the Andes where the first coca shrubs grew. By the 2010s, the trade had extended its reach into Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. No longer was cocaine primarily an American obsession. It had become a worldwide enterprise with supply chains as complex as those used by multinational corporations. Europe emerged as one of the most profitable markets. In cities like London, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Berlin, cocaine became a weekend ritual for millions of people. Nightlife scenes normalized its presence. Social gatherings treated it as casually as alcohol. Prices were higher than in the United States, and purity was often greater, making Europe a priority destination for traffickers. African nations, particularly in West Africa, became major transit hubs. Weak governance, corruption, and economic instability made regions like Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, and Mali vulnerable to exploitation. Dozens of tons of cocaine flowed through these countries each year, destined for Europe. Entire political structures were infiltrated. Guinea-Bissau became known as Africa's first narco-state, a place where the military, politicians, and traffickers operated hand in hand. Australia, geographically distant from cocaine-producing regions, experienced some of the highest prices in the world. A kilo of cocaine that sold for $25,000 in Colombia could sell for over $200,000 in Sydney. This attracted not only Colombian and Mexican cartels, but organized crime groups from the Middle East, East Asia, and the Balkans. The global web of cocaine trafficking grew more intricate, more diverse, more resilient. But even as the world consumed more cocaine, the places that produced it paid the highest price. In Colombia, coca cultivation, despite decades of eradication efforts, began rising again. Farmers, caught between poverty and threats from armed groups, had few alternatives. Cocoa fields spread into protected forests, indigenous territories, and biodiversity hotspots. Rainforests were burned, clearing land for crops that would later be processed with chemicals toxic enough to poison entire river systems. In Peru and Bolivia, the story was similar. Cocaine production encroached deeper into the Amazon basin. Laboratories, hidden among the trees, used sulfuric acid, kerosene, ammonia, and cement in crude chemical reactions that left behind contaminated soil and polluted waterways. Rivers that once nourished communities became tainted with toxins. Fish populations collapsed. Children fell ill. Villages suffered the long-term consequences of a drug economy they had no power to escape. Meanwhile, the conflict in Colombia evolved. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, long funded much of their insurgency through taxes imposed on coca producers and traffickers. Right-wing paramilitary groups formed to fight the guerrillas also became deeply involved in cocaine. Entire regions became war zones where loyalty was determined by necessity, fear, or coercion. For over 5 decades, the country endured a conflict intertwined with the cocaine trade so tightly that separating one from the other became almost impossible. In 2016, Colombia signed a landmark peace agreement with the FARC. The world celebrated. Yet even with the guerrillas demobilizing, cocaine production did not decline. Smaller criminal groups known as bandas criminales filled the vacuum left behind. These groups, less organized but often more violent, competed fiercely for control of coca-growing territories. The peace Colombia hoped for slipped through its fingers. And then, as the world grappled with addiction, violence, and environmental destruction linked to cocaine, another crisis emerged, one that made the drug even deadlier. Fentanyl contaminated the supply chain. For decades, cocaine was thought of as a stimulant, something separate from opioids. But dealers, seeking to enhance effects or mask poor quality product, began cutting cocaine with fentanyl. Users, unaware of the contamination, started overdosing at unprecedented rates. Cocaine-involved deaths surged. People who had never touched opioids were suddenly dying of opioid overdoses. Partygoers, professionals, students, anyone who used cocaine recreationally found themselves at risk of breathing their last after a single dose. The narrative of cocaine changed once again. It was no longer simply a drug of escape or ambition. It became a hidden threat, a gamble with life itself. And yet, despite the danger, demand persisted. Governments responded as they always had: more police, more interdictions, more prison sentences. Yet cocaine remained widely available. Shipments grew larger, more sophisticated. Cartels adapted faster than governments could react. Every seized shipment represented only a fraction of what actually made it through. The war on drugs, declared in the 1970s, was now half a century old. It had cost trillions of dollars. It had incarcerated millions. It had fueled violence across entire regions. And cocaine, its production, distribution, and consumption, was as entrenched as ever. The failure of prohibition was visible not just in statistics, but in stories. Stories of families torn apart, stories of communities consumed by fear, stories of people trapped between poverty and survival, stories of users whose lives unraveled in secrecy. In the United States, the disparities of drug enforcement had left scars that would take generations to heal. During the crack epidemic, harsh sentencing laws disproportionately impacted Black communities. Young men received decades-long prison terms for offenses involving small amounts of crack cocaine, penalties far more severe than those given for powder cocaine, which was used more frequently by wealthier, whiter populations. Families were separated, entire neighborhoods were destabilized, and when opioid addiction later swept through predominantly white communities, the response shifted, away from punishment and toward compassion, treatment, and reform. The double standard illuminated a painful truth. Society chooses whom to forgive. And while America debated policy, coca farmers in South America struggled to survive. Many did not grow coca out of greed but necessity. Coffee, cassava, and fruit brought pennies. Coca brought enough to buy food, medicine, and school supplies. Yet these same farmers faced the threat of aerial fumigation campaigns, where planes sprayed herbicides that destroyed not only coca but everything else: corn, potatoes, plantains, even the soil itself. Families were forced to start over again and again, trapped between government eradication and cartel coercion. The human cost of the cocaine trade was staggering. In Mexico, mothers continued to dig through clandestine graves in search of missing loved ones. In Colombia, mass displacement remained a painful reality. In American cities, the aftershocks of past drug policies continued to shape the future of generations. And globally, overdose deaths climbed, yet still, the drug moved. Still, planes lifted off in the night. Still, boats crossed oceans. Still, traffickers tunneled, bribed, threatened, killed. The powder had woven itself into the fabric of global society, across borders, class lines, and cultures. But perhaps the most difficult truth is this: cocaine's power did not emerge solely from the greed of traffickers or the corruption of governments. It emerged from human desire for escape, for confidence, for endurance, for something more than what life offers in its most difficult moments. The tragedy is not just that cocaine exists, but that so many people feel they need it. And as long as that remains true, the story cannot end. The truth that sits quietly beneath the surface of cocaine's long story is that prohibition, eradication, and punishment have never addressed the deeper forces that keep the drug alive. Cocaine does not persist simply because traffickers produce it. It persists because millions of people across every social class and every corner of the world continue to seek what it offers. And in that seeking, the drug has found a permanent place in the modern human experience. By the late 2010s, the cocaine trade had become more globalized than at any point in history. Its supply chains stretched from remote jungle laboratories to bustling international ports, from impoverished farming villages to glittering metropolitan skylines. It moved through hands both desperate and powerful: farmers scraping by on narrow margins, chemists refining paste into powder, traffickers negotiating shipments worth millions, smugglers risking their lives on dangerous journeys, and users searching for a feeling that seemed just out of reach in their everyday lives. But beneath those movements lay something deeper: a system built on inequality. In coca-growing regions, poverty forced difficult choices. A farmer could grow potatoes or maize, earning barely enough to survive. Or he could plant coca, a crop that brought reliable income, protection from armed groups, and the possibility of a better future for his children. Even when governments offered subsidies to encourage alternative crops, the programs were often inconsistent, underfunded, or overshadowed by threats from criminal groups who controlled the land. To many farmers, cultivating coca was not an act of rebellion or greed, it was survival. In urban centers of the global north, cocaine became part of the rhythm of modern life. People used it not simply for escape, but to accelerate, to push themselves through long hours, to maintain an image of control in a world that demanded constant productivity. The drug became woven into the culture of success, ambition, nightlife, and performance. The illusion it offered, a fleeting sense of clarity, power, and confidence, fit seamlessly into a society defined by competition and pressure. Yet behind every line, inhaled in a penthouse apartment or nightclub bathroom, lay a chain of events that included violence, poverty, exploitation, and environmental destruction, realities worlds away from the polished spaces where the drug was consumed. And for many users, the drug's cost became personal. What began as occasional use shifted into routine, then necessity. The high dwindled, the come down deepened, and the desire to feel normal again pulled them back into a cycle they struggled to escape. But cocaine addiction often hides in plain sight. Unlike opioid withdrawal, which is visible and brutal, cocaine withdrawal is largely psychological: waves of depression, anxiety, irritability, and a hollow emptiness that quietly gnaws at well-being. A person can continue working, socializing, maintaining an image of success, even as their internal world begins to fracture. This quietness makes the addiction harder to detect, harder to treat, and easier to ignore. Meanwhile, the cocaine supply chain itself evolved. After decades of attempts to eradicate coca crops through aerial fumigation and forced eradication, traffickers adapted by planting more resilient crop varieties and shifting cultivation deeper into protected forests. They built laboratories that could be moved quickly if detected. They refined their chemical processes to increase yield. They diversified their routes through Venezuela, Brazil, Ecuador, the Caribbean, and West Africa. Cartels outsourced key components of operations to smaller groups, making the trade more decentralized and harder to dismantle. The global cocaine economy became a constantly shifting organism, one that learned, adapted, and grew more resilient with every attempt to destroy it. And then came fentanyl. The rise of fentanyl changed everything. Once primarily associated with heroin, fentanyl began appearing in cocaine supplies, initially by accident, later by design. Some dealers used it to stretch product. Others added it deliberately, believing that the potent opioid effect would intensify the cocaine high and keep customers returning. The results were catastrophic. People who had never used opioids suddenly overdosed. Partygoers who believed they were taking familiar doses of cocaine collapsed within minutes. Students, professionals, parents, no one was exempt. Cocaine-involved overdose deaths surged across the United States, Canada, and parts of Europe. Toxicology reports showed combinations of substances that magnified risk: cocaine, fentanyl, xylazine, and other adulterants that turned recreational use into lethal danger. The drug that had once been marketed as clean and safe, the champagne of stimulants, had become unpredictably deadly. But while fentanyl changed the risks of cocaine use, it also changed the conversation. Overdose deaths forced policymakers, journalists, and communities to confront the reality that addiction was not limited to certain neighborhoods or social groups. It was everywhere. And the response, focused more on treatment, harm reduction, and understanding, stood in stark contrast to the punitive approach of the crack era. Still, the deep wounds left by decades of harsh drug policies remained. In cities, entire neighborhoods bore the scars of mass incarceration. Families lived with the absence of fathers, brothers, uncles, and sons lost to long prison sentences for small amounts of crack cocaine. Schools struggled to support children growing up amid instability. Economic opportunity dwindled. Trauma accumulated across generations. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the war on drugs had militarized entire regions. Governments deployed armies. Cartels responded with their own paramilitary forces. Civilians became collateral damage. Journalists who reported on corruption were threatened or killed. Entire towns emptied as residents fled cartel violence. The conflict became so entrenched that distinguishing between criminal groups, paramilitaries, guerrillas, and state forces became nearly impossible. The fight against cocaine had created its own form of perpetual conflict. Yet through all this, cocaine continued to move, tons of it every year. Seizures made headlines: 6 tons at a port, 10 tons hidden in fruit shipments, 15 tons discovered in a shipping container. But experts estimated that only a fraction of the global supply was intercepted. For every shipment lost, others succeeded. For every trafficker arrested, another stepped forward. The economics were irresistible. The demand remained strong. The war on drugs, despite its cost in lives and resources, had not diminished the global cocaine market. It had shaped it. And as the decades passed, the world began to see the limits of prohibition more clearly. Countries like Portugal, which decriminalized all drugs in 2001, demonstrated that treating addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal offense could reduce harm, lower overdose deaths, and stabilize communities. Other nations explored harm reduction measures, safe consumption spaces, and treatment-based approaches. But cocaine's unique nature, its stimulant effects, its psychological grip, its global footprint, made it more challenging to address than other substances. There were no widely effective medications for cocaine addiction. Treatment required time, commitment, and resources that many communities lacked. And as long as the drug remained profitable, criminal organizations would continue to produce and traffic it. The story of cocaine ultimately is not just a story of chemistry or crime. It is a story about humanity, the choices we make, the systems we create, the suffering we tolerate, and the futures we imagine. The deeper you travel into the story of cocaine, the more it becomes clear that the drug is not simply a substance, it is a mirror. It reflects the inequalities of the world, the vulnerabilities of the human mind, and the failures of systems meant to protect society. It reveals how desperation can become opportunity, how ambition can turn into exploitation, and how the pursuit of control can unravel entire nations. For governments, the cocaine trade has been both a political battleground and a policy labyrinth. For decades, the primary approach, eradicate, intercept, punish, shaped foreign policy in the Americas. But every time, authorities intensified enforcement, traffickers adapted. A new route appeared, a new method emerged, a new organization rose from the ashes of the one before it. The war on drugs became a cycle, each iteration producing new consequences. Eradication campaigns aimed to destroy coca crops at the source. Planes flew overhead, releasing herbicides meant to kill the plants. Soldiers marched into fields, pulling up crops by hand. But coca, resilient and profitable, returned again and again. Farmers, robbed of their livelihoods, were forced to replant, sometimes deeper into the jungle, sometimes under the threat of armed groups, sometimes simply because there was no other option. Entire families lived under the weight of a global demand they did not create. Interdiction efforts, the attempt to seize cocaine in transit, grew increasingly sophisticated. Authorities used radar, satellite tracking, informants, and multinational intelligence sharing. Naval vessels patrolled the Caribbean. Drones monitored coastlines. Dogs sniffed shipping containers. Ports installed specialized scanners capable of detecting hidden compartments. Yet as security tightened, traffickers innovated. They built submarines that glided just below the ocean's surface. They used fishing boats that blended into ordinary fleets. They packed cocaine into consumer goods, food shipments, furniture, even sculptures. The creativity of the trade became a testament to its profitability. Punishment, the third pillar of drug policy, produced the most lasting human consequences. Millions of people found themselves entangled in a justice system unequipped to treat addiction or address root causes. In the United States, mandatory minimum sentences led to overcrowded prisons, fractured communities, and a generation marked by criminal records that limited access to employment, housing, and education. Entire neighborhoods bore the brunt of aggressive policing. Trust between communities and law enforcement eroded. And while the policy aimed to reduce drug use, it did little to address the psychological, economic, and social forces that drove addiction. As years passed and policies failed, frustration grew. Families mourned, loved ones lost to violence, overdose, incarceration. Policymakers debated new strategies. Public health experts called for treatment-based approaches. Community leaders demanded reform. Yet the drug itself continued to move silently across oceans and borders, shaping lives in its wake. In many ways, cocaine's survival reflects something profoundly human. Its effects, temporary confidence, heightened focus, the illusion of control, speak to desires that exist in individuals and societies alike. People seek escape, ambition, clarity. They seek relief from monotony, from pressure, from pain, from fear. Cocaine promises a shortcut, an elevation, a momentary transformation. And in a world that often rewards speed and performance, the drug fits seamlessly into the demands of modern life. But beneath its allure lies a darker truth. Cocaine does not simply enhance, it takes, slowly, quietly, steadily. It takes time, it takes money, it takes relationships, it takes dreams, it takes health. For some, it takes life. And the taking often begins before anyone notices. Cocaine addiction can evolve subtly. A person begins using occasionally, at parties, at celebrations, during long work sessions. The effects feel manageable, even empowering. But over time, tolerance builds. The line that once produced excitement now barely registers. The come down becomes heavier. The desire to feel normal again intensifies. Soon, the drug is no longer associated with pleasure, but necessity. And necessity becomes dependence. But unlike other addictions, cocaine dependence often hides behind functioning exteriors. A person may continue working successfully, appearing composed even as their internal world deteriorates. They may lie to themselves, to others, to anyone who tries to help. They may rationalize their use. Just this weekend, just one more time, just to get through this moment. By the time the cracks appear, the foundation has already begun to crumble. Treatment is possible, but it requires support, time, and understanding. Yet many societies lack accessible mental health care or addiction services, and the stigma surrounding cocaine, particularly outside the glamorous circles where it is normalized, prevents people from seeking help until they reach a breaking point. Meanwhile, the drug's global journey continues. In South America, new routes emerge. In the Amazon, deeper forests are cleared. In the Andes, new cultivars of coca are planted, plants engineered by farmers to resist eradication and produce higher yields. Criminal groups diversify, merging cocaine trafficking with illegal mining, human trafficking, extortion, and political corruption. Governments struggle to keep pace, contending with limited resources and institutions strained by corruption. In Central America, cocaine shipments move through Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, countries already grappling with gang violence, poverty, and political instability. Some communities become waypoints for traffickers, others become battlegrounds. Lives are disrupted, displaced, or destroyed by conflicts that began far beyond their borders. In Mexico, the war between cartels and the government continues to evolve. New factions emerge as old ones fracture. Some groups expand into fentanyl production, capitalizing on the synthetic drug's profit margin. Others deepen their involvement in cocaine trafficking, controlling key border points with brutal efficiency. Civilians navigate daily life in a landscape shaped by fear of extortion, of stray bullets, of disappearances, of a system where justice is uncertain. In Europe, cocaine becomes increasingly pure and widely available. Organized crime groups from the Balkans, Italy, and Albania enter the EU trade, partnering with South American traffickers. Ports in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain see record seizures. Yet experts estimate that even these captures represent only a small fraction of the cocaine entering the continent. And in Africa, transit countries struggle against corruption and limited resources. Local populations bear the consequences of a trade that moves through their territories but rarely benefits them. Violence, addiction, and political instability follow in its wake. Through it all, one constant remains. The global demand for cocaine shows no signs of disappearing. Some people use it for pleasure, some for confidence, some for escape, some out of pain, some out of habit, and some, too many, never realize the danger hidden within the powder they consume. Because today, more than ever, cocaine is laced with risks far beyond its original chemistry. Fentanyl contamination creates an unpredictable landscape where even a single use can be fatal. Users who believe they are familiar with the drug's effects may find themselves unknowingly stepping into a far more dangerous world. The human cost ripples outward. Families grieving sudden losses, communities grappling with overdose crises, public health systems straining under the weight of preventable deaths. Yet despite increasing awareness, the contamination persists. It reflects a broader truth. When a substance becomes part of an illicit market, safety cannot be guaranteed. Criminal organizations prioritize profit, not the well-being of consumers. And the more the drug trade operates in the shadows, the more unpredictable and dangerous the supply becomes. But what makes cocaine's story even more tragic is that the suffering it has caused was, in many ways, avoidable. Had early policy been guided by public health rather than moral panic, had communities been supported rather than criminalized, had root causes been addressed rather than symptoms punished, the landscape might look very different. Yet, this is the world we inherited. A world shaped by fear, politics, inequality, and the relentless pursuit of profit. But the story is not finished. There is still time to choose a different path. If there is one lesson woven throughout the long history of cocaine, it is this. Every attempt to control it has revealed more about human systems than about the drug itself. Cocaine has acted as a lens through which the world's deepest fractures become visible. Economic inequality, political corruption, racial bias, underfunded health systems, and the universal desire for relief from hardship. As long as these forces persist, cocaine will have a place. The leaf may have come from the jungle, but the demand came from us. In the United States, the war on drugs left behind a patchwork of contradictions. On one side, policymakers spoke of safety and morality. On the other, communities suffered under punitive laws that rarely distinguished between addiction and criminal intent. The 1980s and 1990s saw thousands of people imprisoned for possession of crack cocaine, sentences far harsher than those given to users of powder cocaine, despite the substances being chemically identical. These disparities did not just affect individuals, they reshaped entire neighborhoods. Homes were left empty, children were left without parents, schools struggled under the weight of absent caregivers and growing trauma. Employment opportunities dwindled for anyone with a criminal record, making reintegration nearly impossible. A single prison sentence became a lifelong barrier, one that rippled outward into future generations. And while crack ravaged poor neighborhoods, powder cocaine, used by wealthier Americans, was quietly dismissed as a recreational vice. Only decades later did society begin to confront the inconsistencies. The opioid crisis, striking primarily white suburban and rural communities, forced the country to reevaluate its language. Addiction became a disease, not a crime. Treatment replaced incarceration. Compassion replaced condemnation. Yet for many, the shift felt bittersweet. It highlighted a truth too painful to ignore. Empathy was not extended evenly. Still, progress began. Laws changed, sentencing disparities were reduced, some states explored restorative justice and treatment over punishment, but the wounds of the past remained deep, and the cocaine trade continued to evolve far beyond American borders. In Latin America, governments faced a different challenge. Entire regions were economically dependent on coca cultivation, either directly or indirectly. Eradication campaigns, whether conducted by ground forces or aerial fumigation, often destroyed legitimate crops, contaminated soil, and deepened mistrust between rural communities and the state. Some families watched as soldiers tore up the only income they had. Others saw planes spray herbicides that sickened children and livestock. And when farmers demanded alternatives, they were met with bureaucratic promises that rarely materialized. In these same regions, criminal groups offered protection, seeds, credit, and guaranteed buyers. They provided justice, brutal but swift, in places where the state was absent. They controlled roads, markets, and even local governance. To many farmers, the choice was not between legality and illegality, it was between survival and starvation. This dynamic created a cycle that enforcement alone could never break. Every time the government destroyed a coca field, another appeared deeper in the forest. Every time a cartel leader was arrested, a successor stepped forward. Every time a smuggling route was disrupted, a new one opened. Cocaine had become not just a commodity, but an economy unto itself. And the consequences extended well beyond those who grew or transported it. Environmental devastation spread across the Amazon basin as forests were cleared for coca cultivation and clandestine laboratories. Chemicals used to extract. Cocaine paste leaked into rivers, killing fish and rendering water undrinkable. Regions once rich with biodiversity became scarred by deforestation and pollution. The environmental cost of cocaine, rarely discussed by consumers, was profound. Even so, the trade persisted. Meanwhile, in cities across the world, cocaine carved out a distinct identity. It became the drug of nightclubs, private parties, corporate retreats, and music festivals. For some, it symbolized rebellion. For others, sophistication. It circulated among artists seeking inspiration, executives chasing productivity, and young people exploring boundaries. Cocaine's versatility made it adaptable to each environment, each culture, each desire. But no matter how glamorous the surroundings, cocaine brought the same psychological toll. Users described the high as clean, energizing, clarifying, a feeling of connection to one's own potential. But the come-down was equally intense. Depletion, anxiety, irritability, a quiet longing for the brief confidence the drug provided. Over time, these cycles eroded well-being. Relationships suffered, work suffered, mental health deteriorated. The line between choice and compulsion blurred. For some, the drug led to spirals of paranoia, whispers in quiet rooms, shadows that seemed to move, a persistent suspicion that someone was watching. Cocaine-induced psychosis, once reported in medical journals of the 19th century, remained a very real danger. Yet many users hid their struggles, fearing judgment or the loss of social standing. But even the risks of addiction and mental deterioration did not compare to the new threat: contamination. Fentanyl turned casual experimentation into Russian roulette. Stories spread of people who used cocaine at a party, only a few lines, nothing unusual, and collapsed minutes later. Some were revived by quick-thinking friends with naloxone. Others were found too late, lives cut short by a substance they never intended to consume. The unpredictability of modern cocaine reflected the instability of the market itself. Criminal organizations sought profits at any cost. Cutting agents increased volume, reduced expenses, and masked impurities. Users, unaware of what lay within each gram, gambled with every dose. And the more contaminated the supply became, the more difficult it was for public health systems to respond. Yet, despite the mounting dangers, global demand rose. This paradox, greater risk, higher consumption, reveals something fundamental about cocaine's grip. For many, the drug promises relief from a burden they cannot name. It promises to smooth the edges of life, to amplify what feels muted, to soften what feels sharp. In moments of exhaustion, cocaine offers energy. In moments of insecurity, it offers confidence. In moments of despair, it offers escape. The tragedy is that these promises come at a cost few consider until it is too late. Yet throughout all of this, one question echoes louder than any. What would it take to end the cycle? For some, the answer lies in legalization and regulation. A controlled market that removes power from cartels, ensures product safety, and directs profits toward treatment and education. For others, the idea feels dangerous, unthinkable. Some argue for more enforcement, more laws, more military intervention. Others argue for compassion, understanding, and public health solutions that reduce harm rather than punish it. There is no consensus, no roadmap, only the recognition that the old strategies have failed and the world can no longer ignore the consequences. And so we return to the beginning, to a simple leaf growing in the mountains, used by indigenous peoples for millennia without chaos, without addiction, without global markets or violence. A leaf that once sustained life now fuels an industry of death and suffering. A leaf transformed by chemistry, capitalism, and human desire into one of the most destructive commodities in modern history. How did we get here? How does a plant become an empire? How does a powder reshape nations? The story is not finished. The ending has not been written. But the path forward, whatever it becomes, will require courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront truths long buried beneath stigma and fear. If we step back and look at the story of cocaine from a distance, from the ancient terraces of the Andes to the glittering skyscrapers of global finance, from clandestine jungle labs to quiet suburban homes, the pattern becomes startlingly clear. Cocaine's journey is not the story of a single plant or a single powder. It is the story of human systems colliding with human vulnerability. It is the story of how societies respond to pain, ambition, inequality, and fear. It is a mirror held up to our collective nature, reflecting truths many would rather not see. Throughout its history, cocaine has been shaped by the pressures of the world around it. When European scientists sought to isolate the active ingredient in coca leaves, they did so in an era driven by the belief that chemistry could solve everything. When pharmaceutical companies embraced cocaine, they did so in an age hungry for miracle cures and quick fixes. When entrepreneurs like John Pemberton added coca extract to beverages, they did so in a culture fascinated by modernity and novelty. And when powerful criminal organizations discovered its profitability, they did so in societies fractured by inequality and corruption. Cocaine, in its modern form, exists because the world created the perfect conditions for it to thrive. But perhaps the most striking truth is that the drug does not behave like most commodities. It does not obey the usual laws of supply and demand. Instead, it follows a different logic, one fueled by criminal innovation and global desperation. When governments crack down on production, the price rises, incentivizing more production. When smuggling routes close, traffickers create new ones. When demand falls in one region, it rises in another. Cocaine flows like water. Wherever there is space, it fills it. The drug's resilience lies not only in its chemistry, but in its human appeal. Cocaine promises transformation. For centuries, the coca leaf helped indigenous peoples endure harsh environments. In the modern world, cocaine offers a different kind of endurance, the ability to push beyond limits, to dull discomfort, to amplify confidence, to mask insecurity. It promises to make life easier, even if only for a moment. But like all illusions, it eventually demands repayment. For those who use it casually, cocaine can appear harmless. A line here, a line there. Something to smooth the edges of social interactions or heighten the energy of a night out. But with time, the drug's impact deepens, sleep becomes disrupted, mood swings intensify, anxiety grows, relationships strain. The mind begins to anticipate the next dose before the effects of the last have even faded. And the more a person relies on cocaine to feel normal, the further they drift from themselves. Some users experience paranoia so deeply rooted, it feels like their reality has shifted. They hear whispers in empty rooms, sense threats in harmless gestures, feel watched even when they are alone. Cocaine psychosis, documented since the drug's earliest medical experiments, remains one of its most terrifying consequences. It reminds us that the power cocaine holds is not just chemical, but psychological. Yet for all its dangers, many who struggle with cocaine addiction never receive treatment. Some hide their use out of shame. Others fear legal consequences. Still, others lack access to mental health care or are trapped in cycles of poverty and instability that make recovery nearly impossible. Addiction, in this sense, is not merely a personal struggle, but a societal failure, a reflection of systems that prioritize punishment over healing. But cocaine's impact stretches far beyond individuals. It reshapes entire communities. In Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, and beyond, criminal organizations built on cocaine profits have grown into paramilitary forces capable of challenging the state itself. They control territories, collect taxes, and enforce their own laws. They offer protection to those who comply and violence to those who resist. In some regions, cartels function as shadow governments, blurring the line between crime and governance. In these places, ordinary people live under constant threat. A wrong word, an unpaid fee, a mistaken identity, any of these can lead to kidnapping, disappearance, or death. Families flee their homes, leaving behind everything they know. Migrants heading north are targeted for extortion or forced labor. Journalists who investigate the cartels are silenced, often permanently. Politicians who oppose them risk assassination. Violence becomes a language spoken across entire landscapes. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming force, communities persist. Mothers form search collectives, combing fields and forests for the remains of missing loved ones. Activists demand accountability and reform. Local leaders work tirelessly to provide alternatives for young people vulnerable to recruitment by criminal groups. Courage endures even where hope seems scarce. But the truth remains. The cocaine trade thrives in the spaces where institutions are weak, where opportunities are limited, and where trauma runs deep. It fills the gaps left by neglect, corruption, and inequality. It becomes a distorted form of order in places where official systems have failed. And while violence rages in producing and transit countries, the consumers in wealthier nations often remain insulated from these realities. The cocaine that appears on a nightclub table or in a private apartment carries with it an invisible trail, Farmers displaced by eradication campaigns, children orphaned by cartel violence, ecosystems poisoned by chemical waste, migrants fleeing territories dominated by criminal groups, users trapped in cycles of addiction, families grieving sudden overdoses. But the trail is easy to forget when the powder is clean, white, and silent. Meanwhile, the war on drugs rages on. Billions of dollars continue to be spent each year on law enforcement, border security, and interdiction efforts. Armies deploy, police train, courts prosecute, prisons fill. Yet time and time again, the same conclusion emerges. Prohibition has not eliminated cocaine. It has shaped it into something more dangerous, more profitable, more violent. Every cartel taken down is replaced by another. Every captured shipment is a fraction of what gets through. Every imprisoned trafficker becomes a footnote in a far larger story. The war on drugs, in many ways, has become a war without a defined endpoint, a conflict sustained by political necessity rather than measurable success. But if the war on drugs is failing, what comes next? Some argue for decriminalization, treating drug use as a health issue rather than a criminal one. Others advocate for full legalization and regulation, believing that only by removing control from criminal organizations can violence be reduced. Still others believe in harm reduction approaches, safe consumption spaces, drug testing programs, expanded treatment options, counseling, social support. No approach is perfect. Each carries risks. Each challenges deeply held beliefs about morality, responsibility, and freedom. But what is clear is that continuing along the same path will only deepen the harms already inflicted. To understand the future of cocaine, one must look beyond the drug itself and into the world that sustains it. A world where economic desperation fuels cultivation. A world where political corruption enables trafficking. A world where consumers seek escape from pressure, fear, and longing. A world where punishment overshadows healing. A world where violence becomes a currency of power. The leaf from the Andes has become a global force, reshaping nations, economies, ecosystems, and lives. Its influence stretches across continents, threading itself through history like a quiet, persistent whisper. And as we approach the final chapters of this story, one question grows louder. What do we truly fear more, the drug or the truths it reveals about us? In the end, the story of cocaine is not truly about a plant or a powder or even the empires built upon it. It is about the world that allowed such a substance to rise, expand, and entrench itself across continents. It is about the conditions, historical, social, political, and psychological, that turned a simple jungle leaf into one of the most profitable and destructive commodities humanity has ever known. To understand why cocaine persists, we must understand what people are searching for when they reach for it. For some, cocaine becomes a companion to ambition. They seek to outrun exhaustion, to sharpen their thoughts, to feel invincible in a world that demands constant output. These are professionals, students, executives, people who have been taught that productivity is virtue, that rest is weakness, that success must be pursued at any cost. Cocaine fits neatly into that narrative. It provides a fleeting illusion of mastery, a temporary sense of superiority over the limits of the human body. For others, cocaine becomes an escape. Life feels heavy, overwhelming, unkind. Responsibilities stack like weights on the chest. Memories haunt, dreams fade. In those moments, cocaine becomes a false doorway, one that leads not out of suffering, but deeper into it. Yet the promise of temporary relief is enough to draw people back again and again. And then there are those who use it, because the world has given them few alternatives. They have grown up amid violence, poverty, and generational trauma. Cocaine becomes both a coping mechanism and a currency, something to numb the pain, something to sell for survival, something to believe in when little else offers hope. The drug behaves differently for each person, but the root remains the same. Cocaine thrives in the spaces where humanity struggles. That truth is mirrored in the nations where cocaine is produced. In the Andean regions of South America, coca cultivation offers what few other crops can: stability. For a farmer living miles from the nearest paved road, where government presence is minimal and markets are distant, Coca is one of the only ways to ensure a reliable income. It grows well in rugged soil. It can be harvested multiple times a year. Buyers come directly to the farms, cash in hand. And in many regions, refusing to grow coca can invite violence from armed groups who depend on the trade. Eradication efforts have only deepened these struggles. When fumigation planes pass overhead, spraying herbicides that blanket fields, it is not only coca plants that die. Food crops wither. Soil becomes infertile. Rivers become polluted. Children become ill. Families lose everything, and when the government fails to provide compensation or alternatives, the farmers return to coca, because to abandon it is to accept starvation. The drug war, in this context, becomes a cycle of suffering that punishes the poor for the choices imposed on them by circumstance. Meanwhile, in the cities where cocaine is consumed, the suffering often hides behind closed doors, cloaked in silence. Addiction does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears as a friend missing from gatherings, someone increasingly irritable, someone withdrawing from relationships, someone who seems fine until suddenly they are not. And in the most tragic moments, addiction ends quietly, without warning. Fentanyl contamination has made cocaine more unpredictable than ever before. A single night of celebration can turn into a fatal overdose. Parents lose children, partners lose loved ones, communities lose members who never believed they were at risk. The tragedy is compounded by shame, by stigma, by the fear that speaking openly about drug use dishonors the dead. Yet, silence only perpetuates misunderstanding, leaving others vulnerable to the same fate. Still, for every death, thousands continue to use cocaine, not out of ignorance, but out of longing, for relief, for energy, for confidence, for escape. The drug's power lies not simply in its chemistry, but in its ability to meet emotional needs that society has failed to address. And so the question becomes, what would it take to reduce the harm cocaine causes? Some experts argue that as long as cocaine remains illegal, it will remain dangerous. Illicit markets have no incentive to ensure purity or safety. Criminal organizations thrive on prohibition. Violence follows the profits. To solve the problem, they say, society must take control of the drug itself, regulating production, controlling distribution, taxing sales, and using those funds to support treatment and education. Other experts disagree, believing that legalization would increase use and normalize a substance that can cause profound harm. They fear a world where cocaine becomes as socially accepted as alcohol, where corporations market it, where addiction becomes even more widespread. They argue instead for broader decriminalization, removing criminal penalties for users while maintaining strict enforcement against traffickers. Still, others believe the focus must shift entirely toward addressing root causes: poverty, trauma, inequality, and mental health. They argue that cocaine is not the disease, but the symptom. There is no clear answer. No single strategy can unravel the complex web that cocaine has woven through global society. But what is certain is that history has already shown what does not work. Decades of punishment have not reduced demand. Billions spent on interdiction have not stopped supply. Military intervention has not brought peace. Prohibition has not extinguished the drug. It has made it more profitable, more violent, and more dangerous. To imagine a different future, we must first understand the forces that made cocaine what it is. A leaf, once used spiritually and medicinally by Andean communities, transformed by chemistry into a crystalline stimulant. A powder embraced by doctors, entrepreneurs, artists, and criminals alike. A commodity that built empires, toppled governments, fueled wars, devastated families, and reshaped economies. A substance that reveals the weaknesses of systems meant to protect us and the vulnerabilities of human nature itself. Cocaine is not simply a drug. It is a story of desire, exploitation, resilience, and suffering. A story of how something so small can ripple outward across continents, crossing borders and classes, touching lives in ways both visible and hidden. And though its future remains uncertain, one truth stands clear. The path forward will require compassion, honesty, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable realities. Because the story of cocaine is, at its core, a story about us. As we near the end of this long and winding journey, it becomes impossible to ignore a simple but profound truth. Cocaine is not an isolated phenomenon. It is not an accident. It is not a force that emerged spontaneously in the shadows. Cocaine exists because the world made room for it. It exists because human beings across cultures and centuries have consistently sought ways to alter their minds, to push past limitations, to escape discomfort, or to heighten their experience of life. Cocaine is one chapter in a story that began long before chemistry, long before colonization, long before the modern notions of legality and crime. From the earliest shamans of the Andes to the laboratories of Europe, from the bars of 19th century America to the clubs of modern cities, cocaine has followed the trajectory of human desire. It has adapted to every era, absorbing the values, ambitions, and anxieties of each generation that touched it. And in doing so, it became more than a substance. It became a mirror reflecting our pursuit of control over our bodies, our emotions, our performance, a mirror reflecting our fear of vulnerability, of inadequacy, of slowing down, a mirror reflecting the inequalities that shape our world, where one person's party is another person's peril, a mirror reflecting the consequences of policy built on fear rather than understanding. But to see cocaine only through its destructive lens is to miss part of the story. It is also a tale of endurance, of people surviving in environments shaped by forces beyond their control. In the Andean highlands, coca was never a drug. It was a lifeline, a companion to labor, a spiritual thread woven into daily existence. When colonial powers turned the plant into a tool of exploitation, the leaf endured. When chemists extracted its alkaloids, turning it into a stimulant for modern medicine, the leaf endured. When traffickers weaponized its value to build empires of violence, the leaf endured. It adapted, as humans adapted, to the world around it. But endurance is not the same as safety. Cocaine's evolution into a global commodity came with devastating consequences. Families torn apart, communities displaced, nations destabilized, violence normalized, and woven through it all, the quiet suffering of individuals caught in the web, those who used cocaine to cope, to celebrate, to perform, to forget. People who never intended to become dependent, who never imagined that a moment's choice would echo through their lives, changing everything. Yet for all the pain and chaos it has caused, cocaine remains a substance shrouded in myth. To some it is glamorous, the drug of elites, of celebrity, of power. To others it is demonic, the cause of violence, addiction, and decay. But neither myth captures the full picture. Cocaine is neither glamorous nor monstrous, it is simply potent. And in a world marked by pressure and inequality, potency becomes attractive. The contradictions that surround cocaine are everywhere. Governments ban it, yet millions use it. Law enforcement arrests sellers, yet demand fuels an unending supply. Society condemns addiction, yet glamorizes the lifestyles that promote it. Media sensationalizes cartel violence, yet ignores the policies that empower them. People fear overdose, but overlook the deeper wounds that fuel drug use. These contradictions reveal a society at odds with itself, wanting safety but resisting change, craving control but failing to understand the forces at play. It is easy to point fingers at producers, at traffickers, at users. But the blame, if blame is even the right word, is more diffuse. It lies in the structures that create desperation, in the cultural narratives that celebrate productivity over well-being, in the failures of health systems to support those struggling with trauma, stress, or mental illness, in the global inequalities that turn coca cultivation into a necessity rather than a choice, in the policies that treat addiction as a crime instead of a condition. And so the story of cocaine forces a question, one that sits at the edge of every debate, every legislative proposal, every moral judgment. What kind of world makes a drug like this necessary? A world where people feel overwhelmed by pressure. A world where escape is more accessible than healing. A world where the poor carry the consequences of the wealthy's indulgence. a world where punishment replaces compassion, a world where the pain of one nation becomes the profit of another. As long as these conditions persist, cocaine, or something like it, will persist as well. Toward the end of his life, Sigmund Freud, once an enthusiastic proponent of cocaine, quietly distanced himself from the drug that had captivated him. He recognized, too late, the dangers it posed, dangers he could not foresee when he was still young, still searching for breakthroughs, still rushing to make his mark. His early writings on cocaine became an embarrassment, a shadow he tried to outrun. But in a strange way, Freud's arc mirrors society's arc. We embrace what we do not fully understand. We mythologize our own discoveries. We chase solutions without acknowledging their risks. And when those risks become undeniable, we struggle to accept responsibility for what we have created. As the decades passed, the myths evolved. Cocaine moved from medicine to consumer product, from illicit thrill to status symbol, from underground commodity to geopolitical force. At every stage, the world reshaped itself around the drug, and the drug reshaped itself around the world. Now, in the 21st century, cocaine stands at a crossroads. Production has reached record levels. Organized crime continues to evolve, moving beyond simple trafficking into sophisticated multinational operations. Synthetic drugs threaten to overshadow cocaine's dominance, yet cocaine remains deeply embedded in global markets. Overdose deaths rise, communities struggle, families grieve, policymakers debate, and still the flow continues. We are left with a difficult truth. Cocaine is not a problem that can be eradicated. It is a problem that must be understood. Because until we understand it, its origins, its allure, its consequences, we cannot hope to address it meaningfully. Until we see the human beings behind every step of its journey, we cannot hope to create policies that heal instead of harm. Until we acknowledge that cocaine thrives in the fractures of society, we cannot hope to mend those fractures. The leaf at the center of this story has traveled far from its mountain home. It has touched every corner of the world. It has built fortunes and destroyed lives. It has sparked wars and shaped generations. It has become, in many ways, a symbol of modern civilization, its pressures, its inequalities, its desires, its contradictions. And even now, as you listen to this story, cocaine continues to move through shadows and streets, through borders and bodies, through economies and imaginations. It is, for better or worse, part of the world we have inherited and the world we continue to build. The question is not whether cocaine will remain. It is what we will choose to learn from its story, and perhaps more importantly, what we will choose to change. If you trace the path of a single gram of cocaine backward, from the polished table in a penthouse, from the dim bathroom of a nightclub, from the quiet loneliness of a bedroom, you begin to see how many lives, landscapes, and histories that 1 gram has touched. It does not exist in isolation. It is the culmination of a chain that begins thousands of miles away, in places where the world looks very different from where it ends. Picture the beginning. A farmer wakes before dawn in the foothills of the Andes. The mountains are cold, the air thin. He steps outside with a machete in hand, walking toward rows of coca shrubs. They stretch across the hillside in tight green lines, resilient in a way few crops can be in such rugged terrain. He is not a criminal. He is not a villain. He is a man with a family, living in a region where opportunities are scarce. Coca pays the bills. Coca keeps food on the table. Coca ensures that his children can go to school. Without coca, there is nothing. By midday, the leaves are harvested and placed in large pits to be trampled, mixed with lime and gasoline, beginning the slow transformation into coca paste. The farmer knows the risks. He knows the chemicals are toxic. He knows the guerrillas or paramilitaries will demand a cut. He knows the government might come, spraying herbicides from the sky, destroying his fields. But he also knows the truth that has shaped his life for years. Coca is the only crop that guarantees survival. From these rural hills, the coca paste moves through hands hardened by conflict. Guerrilla fighters may tax the shipment. Armed groups might transport it through jungle corridors they control. Corrupt officials may escort it past checkpoints. In clandestine labs hidden beneath dense canopies, chemists convert the paste into crystal white cocaine hydrochloride. The air smells of gasoline, ether, and fear. Rivers nearby run murky from chemical runoff. Forests shrink, burned or cleared to make space for more labs, more fields, more profit. Once processed, cocaine begins its long journey north, by truck or mule, by plane or boat, by submarine or drone. It slips across borders and coastlines, carried by people who often have no other choice. Some are teenagers, promised money they will never fully receive. Some are migrants desperate for passage. Some are coerced, threatened, or trapped. The drug moves not because traffickers are clever, though they often are, but because desperation is abundant and opportunity is unevenly distributed across the world. And then there are the traffickers themselves, not the mythic figures of movies, but real people shaped by environments steeped in corruption and violence. Some rise through brutality, others through strategy, others through sheer luck. They build their empires on instability, exploiting weak institutions and fractured societies. They recruit the young, the poor, the desperate, those who see no legitimate path to security or prosperity. Every link in the chain is held together by compromise, by fear, by greed, by survival. And then, at the end of this long and perilous journey, the drug arrives in the places where it is consumed. It enters cities that glitter at night, suburb streets lined with quiet houses, college dorms buzzing with youthful energy, businesses where ambition is currency. It slips into pockets, onto mirrors, into rolled-up bills, into the nostrils of people who rarely consider the path it traveled to get there. To them, it is simply a product, a recreational thrill, a performance enhancer, a social lubricant, a temporary escape. It is easy to forget the people who grew it, processed it, transported it, fought for it, killed for it, died for it. The violence is invisible, the suffering distant, the connection abstract. But the chain is real. Each decision made along the way, each crop planted, each chemical mixed, each bribe paid, each body buried, each shipment smuggled, accumulates into the moment when a user inhales a line of powder. It is a reminder that no drug exists without context, and cocaine's context is one of the most complex ever created. But complexity does not absolve the harm. The drug that begins in the hands of a farmer ends in the bloodstream of someone who may or may not fully understand what they are taking. Maybe it will give them the energy they crave. Maybe it will make them feel confident, alive, powerful. Maybe it will help them forget their problems, if only for a moment. Or maybe it will send their heart racing into dangerous rhythms. Maybe it will trigger anxiety or paranoia. Maybe it will be laced with fentanyl. Maybe it will be their last breath. The uncertainty is part of the drug's danger, but it is also part of its allure. Humans have always been drawn to risk, to altered states, to the possibility of feeling something more. Cocaine promises this more in a way that is immediate, intense, and seductive. It sells the illusion that limitations can be outrun, that insecurities can be silenced, that exhaustion can be conquered. For a brief moment, it feels like transformation. But cocaine does not give without taking. It extracts payment in ways both subtle and severe. For some, the cost is physical, cardiac strain, insomnia, weight loss, anxiety, panic. For others, the cost is psychological, paranoia, obsession, compulsive use, depression. For many, the cost is relational, broken trust, damaged families, isolation. And for far too many, the cost is fatal. Yet the world continues to generate demand. Demand fuels cultivation. Cultivation fuels trafficking. Trafficking fuels violence. Violence fuels instability. Instability fuels cultivation again. The cycle is almost perfect in its tragic symmetry. But within this cycle are millions of lives, each carrying stories of struggle, resilience, grief, and hope. There are families who plant coca out of necessity, children who navigate roads controlled by cartels, parents who lose their sons and daughters to addiction or violence, workers who risk everything to escape poverty, and users who fall into dependency without ever realizing how close they are to catastrophe. This is not a story with simple heroes or simple villains. It is a story with countless participants, each shaped by forces larger than themselves. And at the very center of it all lies a leaf, quiet, ancient, and unassuming. A leaf that became a commodity that became an empire that became a global crisis, a crisis that continues to unfold day by day, line by line. If cocaine's story ended here, with its violence, its profits, its tragedies, that would be enough to fill volumes. But history rarely pauses at the moment we expect. The cocaine trade, like every large system shaped by human behavior, continues to evolve. It shifts in response to pressure, adapts to new environments, and follows the currents of global change with a kind of cold, relentless intelligence. And today, as we move deeper into the 21st century, cocaine is entering yet another transformation. For decades, South America was the unquestioned center of cocaine production, but environmental degradation, political upheaval, and the relentless pursuit of traffickers have pushed the industry into new territories. Farmers in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia, already living in precarious conditions, find themselves caught between government crackdowns and the growing demands of criminal groups. Some abandon their crops, others relocate deeper into remote forests. Others turn to synthetic drugs that require no soil, no sunlight, no fields to fumigate. But cocaine producers are not only adapting their geography, they are adapting their methods. New processing techniques yield higher potency. Labs are becoming more mobile, more hidden, more sophisticated. Chemical suppliers have become increasingly global, allowing traffickers to source ingredients from Europe, Asia, even online markets that move faster than any law enforcement agency can track. The drug that once depended on remote mountain farms can now be produced with shocking efficiency. And as the production evolves, so too does the trafficking. Gone are the days when smugglers relied solely on small planes flying low to avoid radar or fast boats darting across the Caribbean. Those methods still exist, but they are only part of a much larger arsenal. Cargo ships carrying hundreds of containers now become floating puzzles for authorities to solve. Commercial flights hide cocaine in luggage, clothing, or even within passengers themselves. Trucks haul it across borders concealed behind legitimate cargo. Tunnels, drones, submarines, and encrypted communication networks turn trafficking into a technological challenge more than a logistical one. What once resembled a criminal enterprise now operates with the structure and complexity of a multinational corporation. And while the methods grow more complex, the market grows more diverse. Cocaine, once concentrated in North America and parts of Europe, has spread across the globe. Demand rises in Africa, Asia, and Australia, regions with growing economies and growing social pressures. The drug follows these pressures like a shadow, promising relief or exhilaration in places where expectations are high and support is low. But with this expansion comes a darker shift. Cocaine is increasingly mixed with other substances, levamisole, phenacetin, and most dangerously, fentanyl. These adulterants are not just fillers. They are profit multipliers. A kilo of pure cocaine can be stretched into several kilos of product, each sold for the same price. This practice, fueled by greed and facilitated by an unregulated market, transforms cocaine into something far more unpredictable and far more lethal. And so, as the drug spreads, so does the risk. But while the trafficking organizations adapt, so too do the societies battling cocaine's consequences. Some governments continue to pursue aggressive enforcement, deploying military forces and expanding prisons. Others look to alternative strategies, harm reduction, decriminalization, social investment. Some cities create safe consumption spaces where drug purity can be tested and overdoses reversed. Some nations shift resources from policing to treatment, acknowledging that addiction cannot be punished away. But even these efforts struggle against a simple reality. Cocaine has embedded itself into the fabric of modern life. In wealthy cities, it has become a symbol of culture, appearing quietly at dinner parties, backstage rooms, penthouse celebrations, private gatherings. In universities, it becomes a tool for performance, another method of staying awake, staying sharp, staying ahead. In industries built on pressure and competition, it becomes an unspoken companion, one line to push through fatigue, one line to quiet doubt, one line to chase an edge in a world that never slows down. And while the wealthy use cocaine without fear of legal consequences, the poor are criminalized for the same substance. In the United States, a homeless man caught with a small amount of cocaine may spend years in prison, while a financier caught with the same amount may go to rehab, return to work, and continue life as though nothing happened. This disparity is not accidental. It is the product of decades of policy shaped by fear and prejudice. Crack cocaine, used largely in poor and black communities, brought harsh sentencing laws that devastated families. Powder cocaine, used largely by the wealthy, brought leniency. Two forms of the same drug, treated as though they existed in different moral universes. The consequences ripple outward. Entire neighborhoods were destabilized, children grew up without parents, opportunities vanished. And even as laws began to change, the damage remained. Trauma that lingers across generations, shaping lives long after the headlines faded. But the contradictions do not end there. Governments condemn the cocaine trade, yet global banks have quietly laundered billions of dollars for trafficking organizations. Corporations unwittingly ship containers filled with cocaine. Politicians speak against drug use publicly while using cocaine privately. And consumers in wealthy nations continue to fuel a system that devastates poorer regions, often without recognizing the harm embedded in every gram they consume. This is the hidden architecture of cocaine's power, a world where morality bends under the weight of profit, where suffering becomes invisible when it occurs far from view, where demand is protected and supply is punished. But even now, amid all this complexity, one thing remains clear. Cocaine is not going away. It will not vanish like a fad. It will not dissolve under military pressure. It will not disappear when one cartel falls, because another always rises. It exists because humans create the conditions for it to exist, conditions of anxiety, ambition, inequality, trauma, and escape. Cocaine thrives where people are pushed beyond their limits. It thrives where communities are abandoned. It thrives where governments fail to meet the needs of their citizens. It thrives where pain outweighs opportunity. It thrives where profit overshadows humanity. And so long as these realities persist, the leaf from the jungle, the leaf that once eased the strain of life in the mountains, will continue its journey through the modern world, reshaped into something far more powerful and far more dangerous. This is the truth at the center of cocaine's story. The drug itself is only the beginning. And so we arrive at the end of this long and winding journey. A journey that began with a small green leaf high in the Andes and wound its way through laboratories, pharmaceuticals, empires, nightclubs, and battlefields. A journey that spans centuries, touching civilizations ancient and modern, shaping lives in ways both profound and invisible. If there is one lesson to take from the story of cocaine, it is this: nothing in human history rises alone. Every substance that becomes powerful becomes so because the world around it allows that power to grow. The coca leaf was never dangerous on its own. For thousands of years it served as a quiet companion to life in harsh landscapes, easing hunger, softening exhaustion, carrying cultural meaning. It was respect, ritual, survival. The danger only emerged when ambition collided with chemistry. When scientists isolated alkaloids they barely understood, when entrepreneurs bottled those alkaloids into consumer products, when early traffickers realized that the modern world was hungry for escape, for energy, for transformation. The leaf didn't change. The world did. And once cocaine existed, once it became portable and potent and profitable, humanity struggled to contain it. The story that followed is not simply the story of a drug. It is the story of systems bending under pressure, governments trying to enforce impossible prohibitions, criminal organizations rising in the cracks left by inequality, communities suffering violence that originates thousands of miles away, lives shaped or shattered by a substance whose path is invisible to most who use it. Even now, decades into the global struggle against cocaine, it remains a force shaped not by its chemistry, but by the world that consumes it. Because cocaine thrives anywhere, humans feel overwhelmed, overlooked, or overburdened. It thrives in places where poverty narrows choices. It thrives in industries that glorify productivity over well-being. It thrives in cultures where vulnerability is hidden and pain is suppressed. It thrives in the shadows of trauma, loneliness, ambition, and despair. And until those deeper wounds are addressed, cocaine will continue to move through the veins of our world, quietly, persistently, relentlessly. But recognizing the truth is not the same as surrendering to it. There are places where new approaches are working, where addiction is treated as a public health challenge rather than a crime, where harm reduction saves lives without judgment, where communities invest in opportunity rather than punishment. These approaches do not promise a world without drugs, but they promise something far more realistic, a world with less suffering. The war on drugs has shown us what doesn't work. The future depends on whether we have the courage to try what might. Because the real story of cocaine is not written in white powder, it is written in people. In the farmer who plants coca because nothing else will keep his children fed, in the woman who uses a small dose before work, believing it makes her strong, in the teenager pressured into smuggling because he sees no other path, in the family shattered by an overdose they never saw coming, in the communities who endure violence they never asked for, in the policymakers who must choose between old fears and new possibilities. Behind every headline, every statistic, every seizure, every arrest, there are human beings shaped by forces larger than themselves, and that is why the story of cocaine will always be larger than the drug itself. It is a story of inequality, ambition, trauma, innovation, desperation, and desire. A story of a world trying to soothe its wounds with something that only deepens them. A story of systems built with the wrong priorities, breaking in the same places again and again. But it is also a story still being written. Cocaine may continue to move through our world, but so do compassion, understanding, and change. The future of this story depends on which of those forces we choose to elevate. One day, perhaps, the leaf from the Andes will return to what it once was, a plant with cultural meaning rather than an international commodity soaked in violence. One day, perhaps, the systems that fuel cocaine's rise will be replaced with ones that lift people up instead of pushing them down. One day, perhaps, the world will finally address the roots instead of the symptoms. Until then, the story remains a warning, one whispered across centuries. When we try to outlaw human pain instead of healing it, we create monsters far larger than the problems we fear. Thank you for staying with me on this long descent into history, humanity, and consequence. If this story made you reflect, question, or see the world differently, then it has done what it was meant to do. Before you go, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your presence in this little global community means more than you know. Until next time, stay curious, stay gentle with yourself, and stay safe.